Welcome to 5 More Minutes. This is the video strategy episode. This week we are focusing on a strategy called the Inclusive Purpose Planner, which is really to build on what we did the last video episode, which was targeting places. And so as we know, that inclusion cannot be just place alone. And so this is really going to look at how can we make these places that we're targeting meaningful for kids, but also under that theme of, moving away from kind of that should model of kind of deficit and looking at for what's wrong, and really trying to target purposeful placements that are strength-based and looking at what's possible as opposed to where people should be. So just as a little review, in the very first video episode, we talked about the evolution of inclusion, and we reviewed some kind of big ideas about what inclusion is. And we talked about how inclusion really needs to be more than just the place, which was my really big misunderstanding the first time that I was trying to learn about inclusion, is that you can't just kind of dump kids in a room with no support for them, no support for teachers, no support for peers, and with no plan. And so this is really about, okay, let's kind of build these places over time. And once we can target these placements, what we're really trying to focus on is how we can build in meaningful roles, responsibilities, and really ensure that there's facilitated peer connections, but being able to do that in multiple places over time, because as we talked about in the last video episode, starting in one place is really important, but you cannot just be included in one place. And so part of the strategy for these episodes are to how do we increase places where kids have purpose over time, because this is really the goal, which is, what inclusion is place and purpose, which is not just targeting the where, but the why. Why are they there? How do we facilitate this purpose in places? And so we have to kind of zoom out a little bit, because this word purpose is a really important word to talk about. And this isn't just for kids with disabilities. If we think about anybody, myself included, we are negotiating place and purpose all the time. I always kind of, when I do my presentations, I talk about the example of going to the car wash. Like I go to the car wash for a very specific reason. I go to the bank for a very specific reason. I go to the grocery store for very specific reasons. And our entire life is created around different purposes. And so the connection between place and purpose is really important. But I realized that a lot of the IEPs that I had been working on with my kids were very purposeful, but they weren't very placeful. And so we really tried to connect place and purpose, because if you don't have places, then it's really, really hard to kind of make those places meaningful to the context. And so I realized that a lot of kids had purposes without places, and were also in a lot of places without place-based purposes. So this is about bringing them together. And there is some really, really great research around, what are these possible purposes? What are these meaningful roles and responsibilities? And in the literature, there's 3 themes that come up, and they're called different things depending on where you look. But to exist successfully, there's 3 purposes that we're negotiating all the time. And like I say, this is not just kids. We're talking everybody, whether it's the grocery store or the hockey rink or a math classroom. And those 3 purposes are, how do we personally exist, how do we socially exist, and how do we intellectually exist? And we need all 3 of them to be successful. Often in school, though, as kids get older, we kind of jump to intellectual, but you can think of students all over the world, regardless of their ability levels, are they have to know how to exist personally. They need to know how to interact with their peers, and they need to know, intellectually, the how to exist within that context that they're in. So many times, there's a lot of kids out there where these purposes intuitively develop. And I think that that's been the assumption for a long time for kids, is that they'll figure it out. They'll know how to exist. They'll know how to interact just by the peer modeling and kind of the referencing that kids sometimes automatically develop. But as our classes are becoming more diverse, sometimes we need to help kids with this and build this and understand this, especially because kids may be coming with their ideas and experiences of how to exist, but because they're coming from diverse places, those experiences sometimes don't align. And so it's just a really important reminder that from K to 12, to really make sure we're constructing these purposes with the kids. And so how do we do this? How do we support? How do we construct so that kids are really clear what those purposes are to exist in these places? And so last video strategy, we looked at place. Today, we're going to look at, okay, so what are these purposes? So the first purpose we're going to look at is the personal purpose. And when I first started learning about personal purpose, I immediately thought it was about behavior. But the more I kind of learned about it, the more I realized this is less about behavior in terms of compliance and more about behavior in terms of identity and regulation. So, I think sometimes we get kind of stuck into the how can we support kids to regulate so that they can comply. But what this is really about is how can we kind of teach and support individuals to, develop their individual identity in whatever way that means, including disability, because disability itself is an identity. And behavior does fall into this, but it's really looking at it from the lens of a positive behavior support as opposed to kind of a deficit model, which I'll show you in a few slides. And this idea of kind of like awareness and regulation of self. And so what are the supports that I need in order to be successful in this place that are definitely connected to behavior, but not about compliance. But in a similar way, in terms of the place, it's not just about supporting an individual in the place, it's also about supporting and developing the skills for a community to support an individual. So, if there's a student with a disability, how are we helping the community to be able to support them? Because I sometimes think we forget that part and we kind of put the onus only on the student with disability to be able to exist. And so this is really a community effort and just that emphasis of co-construction of a personal vision. Because as long as we're telling kids what to do, it's about compliance. And so this might take a little bit more time, but it's so much worth the effort because it's less about the following the rules or following the expectations and instead about constructing them. And the more that kids construct, the more that they buy in. And actually I have a friend who actually says it's even more than that, it's the believe in, which I totally agree with. And so this is about co-constructing a vision for the whole community that includes individuals. How are we going to exist? How are we going to support each other to exist in a behavioral way, but also in an identity way? And how are we going to honor each other's identities within that? Now, we're not just existing alone, we're existing with other people, which we brought up a little bit, and that's really targeting the social purpose, which encompasses two pieces. It's both the interaction with people, but also includes communication, but also this idea of social identity. And, the work and literature around building community is so strong, and this is what we're targeting here. It's, you can't get to the curriculum until you have that community and that sense of identity as a community, which I think we're realizing more and more are competencies that just have to be developed in order to get to the content. And so this is about teaching and supporting positive interactions and communication. The idea of not just personal awareness, but also social awareness, and how does what we do affect others? And so it's that whole idea of awareness and responsibility. It's very, very fine if you need a tool to help you concentrate, but to what effect does that tool influence others or affect others is something to consider. In the same way to building a personal community, this is also about, how does the community support the social existence together too? So this is not just about one, this is about all. And again, co-constructing that vision. There's some really beautiful examples of this in schools where they've, really spent time with the kids to say, like, how are we going to exist together? How are we going to learn together? And how are we going to honor each other and respect each other? And so this is just that reminder that kids need that all the way, K to 12. And the third purpose, because we're not just existing or we're not just existing together, we also have to learn together. And this is the intellectual identity. And thinking about positive behavior supports and positive social supports, this is around positive learning supports and experiences. And the reason why this one is so important to me is because historically this is one that hasn't been addressed for kids with intellectual disabilities, because it's been long believed that kids weren't able to learn. And so I'm really, really thankful for the research and literature that has been developing around presuming competence, about this idea that everybody can learn. And it's about building this community to honor multiple ways of learning and knowing, and also being okay with the fact that we may never know what people are learning, because they may have communication difficulties, but just because we can't capture it doesn't mean it's not happening. And so this is something that has really driven my research, is how do we, support learning even if we can't see it happening. And so these are kind of those three purposes that we're going to build on today in terms of making places purposeful. There is a little bit of a problem with these, though, and if you've been in the field of special education, you probably already see it, but these three purposes are not unfamiliar, but often we don't look at them in terms of identity. These are often deficit areas, and if you've ever written an individual education plan, you know that usually IEPs are filled with one, two, or all three of these areas. So if kids are having behavior difficulties, then we write goals about how they should be behaving. And if they're having social and communication problems, then we write goals about how they should be interacting, and similar with intellectual deficits. And so I think that these are sometimes the root of the should, because we see that kids aren't doing something or they can't do something. And then what ends up happening is we kind of roll ourselves into this deficit paradigm. And, it's not really our fault. We were trained to do this because special education evolved out of the medical model, which is fix what's broken. You have a broken leg, go fix it. But what we're realizing is that, there's some kids that can't be fixed intellectually. And we're also realizing that we don't want to fix kids intellectually, because neurodiversity is just as important as any kind of diversity. And so what often happens is, if kids have difficulty in one, two, or three of these areas, what happens is they kind of get pulled out to another place, and those skills are targeted, and then they get put back in. And this is problematic for a few reasons. The first reason is, if we're pulling out a student to work on a deficit skill in an area, we're assuming that these areas don't affect each other. And you don't need me to tell you that if a student is having difficulties behaviorally, it's probably because of either social or learning difficulties too. And so it's not a clear-cut model like this. The other difficulty with this model is that when you change the place, you change the purpose. And so I know Norman Coutts describes this so perfectly. He says, if you pull a kid out of the swimming pool, teach them how to swim in the parking lot, and then drop them back in the water, kids aren't going to transfer those skills unless they actually teach them how to swim in the water. Because as soon as you change the place, you change the purpose, which is sometimes the problematic assumption that these skills are going to transfer. The other difficulty with this approach is if you pull a student out of a classroom community to target a deficit skill, well, then you're assuming that no one else in the community needs that support. And what we're learning, especially through Universal Design for Learning, is that, what's good for one is actually just good for everybody. And a really nice example of this is in British Columbia, the curriculum has really shifted to an approach of, the personal, social, intellectual skills that are usually designed for kids with disabilities are actually now part of the curriculum for everybody, because what's good for one is good for everyone. And these are competencies that everyone needs to develop, but they can't be developed in isolation, and that's so important. But the other reason why this is problematic, and I think this is a really big one, is if you pull kids out of a community to target a deficit skill, you're assuming that the classroom itself isn't a support. And I see time and time again, kids are pulled out together to work on a deficit skill, but then because all of the kids are together with the same deficit area, there's no one to help co-regulate that experience and environment. Whereas in a classroom community, you have a whole classroom to help co-regulate that. And you see examples of this where we'll put all the kids who can't communicate in a room, and then you're like, well, who are they going to communicate with? Or we'll put all the kids who can't speak English together in a room, and we'll be like, well, who are they going to speak English with? And it's very, very hard sometimes to find staffing for those places, because that staff becomes the only model and the only regulator. Now, there is a time and a place for people to come together, but it has to move away from this deficit grouping to identity groupings. I'm all for small groupings, but I am really advocating to review some of the criteria we use for these groupings, because I think that these kind of deficit groups still exist in almost every school, and I think that it's becoming really problematic because there's so many kids who are diverse and need these goals, and we're running out of places to send them, and we're running out of teachers to teach them. So it's really looking at, well, what's the alternative to this then? Like, how do we still address those skills, but in a strength-based way? So this is an alternative paradigm, which is exactly what we're talking about over the last few weeks, which is, we have to start with the place first. We can't start with the purpose, because the place determines the purpose. And so whether this is a classroom, whether this is a home, whether this is the land, the place is going to determine what the purposes are within that. And because of that, we may have strength and stretch in different areas. For example, if I am learning how to play hockey, my bubbles or my purposes might be in a different formation than if I was presenting, where I have a stronger and more confident skill area. Because I can't skate that's something that is not a strength for me. And so if I think about this from the lens of a hockey rink, I'm going to have different goals or different purposes to help me be successful in that space. In the same way, if the place is, an auditorium where I'm speaking to 2,000 people, my purposes are going to adjust in a different way. And so it's really important to say, okay, so what's the place? What do I personally need to exist? What do I socially need to exist? And then what do I intellectually need to exist? But those are going to change based on the lens of that place. The other thing that I like about this is, the focus of bubbles or purposes in this paradigm is not targeting deficit, it's targeting balance. Because often students might come looking like this, where they have a really, really big strength area, and then maybe they have other areas that are stretches for them. So rather than just targeting the stretches in isolation, what this model is really supporting is, how do we, both as a community and individual, facilitate balance of these purposes? And so how do we kind of utilize our strengths to develop our stretches, but within the place that we actually have to build them, because that's where the power is going to come from. And what I love about that idea of balance is that, like, this isn't new. This really starts to get into holistic frameworks that have been around for a very long time and are connected to the medicine wheel and indigenous pedagogy, which we're just learning more and more is just so helpful to all of us to move in that direction. So here is the strategy. It looks like this, and I have a couple examples for you, but what this is, it's kind of an evolution of an IEP matrix that we used to do around goals and activities. This is a similar idea, but it's targeting places with purposes. And so on the left-hand side, you'll see this is the classroom or the community that we are going to target. And so if you think back to the place planner, this is going to be the place that we want to target for purpose. So at the top, you can see here's the targeted class. So maybe that's a math class. Maybe that is a section of the day with a class. And then the places or the context that this will happen. And so on the left are the possible activities that will make up that place. Beside it is, well, why is everybody doing that community? What's the goal for everyone there? Because that's going to help us know how to target or align kind of the purposes for the individual. And then beside that, you'll see there's 3 possible options for what this could look like for an individual. And what's nice about this is if you have multiple purposes, if you're finding that one purpose isn't going well, you can immediately flip, which is really nice because it's kind of like a blueprint. So let me show you an example. The first example I have is in a social studies grade 9 class. This student, it was really interesting because the student moved to the district that I was working in from a different district. She has autism, and had never been included in a class before. So this was really new, and everyone was very, very nervous. But we're like, let's just start. So we started in the social studies 9 class, and we had an incredible classroom teacher that was just like, yep, let's do it. Let's try it. And the support teacher was like, yep, let's do it. Let's try it. And the EA and the parent, everyone on the board, and just like, yep, let's try it out. But we weren't really sure because Puneet had never been in a classroom before. Puneet was in a self-contained program. And so what we did was we kind of got together, the classroom teacher, the support teacher, the EA, and myself. And this took about an hour after school one day. And we started with the classroom first. And so we asked the teacher, in this block of time, which was 70 minutes, what are some common and regular routines or activities that you do? And so the classroom teacher basically just kind of listed off some ideas. So every day they have a startup activity. Every day they have some sort of engaged reading. Sometimes it's independent. Sometimes it's partner. There's always some current events activity that's usually involves the students. And then there's a lesson. And this is a big one, right? Like this is where new information is presented. And then there's an opportunity for kids to process that, usually in small groups. And at the end of the class, there's a sharing circle, which was a really, really beautiful example of kind of pulling in some community pedagogy and Indigenous pedagogy. And so at the end of the class, all the kids went in a circle and they shared something from the day. Now that could be an experience, that could be something they learned, that could be a story, it could be anything, but they always kind of left the day in this way where they heard each other and they listened to each other. So these were the activities. And so then we said, okay, well, what is the main goal that you have for this activity? So if we look at the startup activity, the main kind of goal for the whole class was to get themselves started, because some kids needed a little bit of a buffer for the start of the class. And so for the first kind of 10, 15 minutes, it was an independent, self-initiated activity that was around vocabulary in some way. Connected to their units. Engaged reading was about 20 minutes, and when that happened in the class, it varied, but often it was independent reading. Sometimes it was partner read, just kind of depends on the day. For current events, what this kind of looked like for the class is every week 2 students would present an article that was in the current news, and then they had to kind of report on it to the class. And there was a little kind of template around what that looked like, was basically kind of like the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why. In the lesson, now, of course, the lesson would change every day, but there was a structure that was common. This teacher was really, really great at not having lessons that were too long or too lecture-based. So he was pretty good at having kind of 20-minute lessons, and then there was some sort of small group or independent activity around that. And then, like I say, the sharing circle was at the very, very end. So if we think about, like, that's the plan for the whole class, then what we did was we said, okay, kind of expertise shifted from the classroom teacher to the support teacher and the EA to say, okay, well, thinking about these activities, what could this look like for Puneet? Not what it should look like, but what could it? Meaning, where is she at in this kind of learning journey, and keeping in mind that she's very new to classrooms with a lot of people. So we started with intellectual purpose, because often I think that this is the one that we often look at last. And because of that, if kids don't see a connection to context, that's often when behavior will happen. So we made sure we planned for her intellectually. And so we really tried to align it. So for her, during the startup activity, one option was we really wanted to support her to also self-start. And so there was basically little bins that had different possible activities. And so, we taught her when she comes to class, she's going to grab the activity bin for word work, and there were topic related words for her to work on too. Puneet wasn't decoding, so her word work was around often like picture vocabulary and kind of looking at initial consonants. Her social purpose, though, was because this was a self-start activity, we also taught her We also taught her that it was okay to ask for help if she was stuck. So that was her social goal during that time. And then her personal purpose was, how are we going to from a positive behavior lens, construct so that she knows. So we basically just kind of thought of it like if we were to create a task analysis. And so the big goal here is initiation. But what this looked like when we broke it down was, you're going to arrive to class, you're going to grab your word work activity bin, you're going to go to your desk, and you're going to start the activity. And so we created a task checklist for her, and you know what? She did great. This wasn't a really long time, but it made it so that she arrived there, and there wasn't a lot of waiting time. She knew exactly what she needed to do. But what was nice about this is, depending on Puneet's needs of the day, whoever was working with her, whether it was a student or the teacher or the EA, they could adjust this depending on how she was doing. So if she needed some initiation, we could start with personal. If she knew exactly what to do, we could go straight to intellectual. And so rather than just pulling her out if things weren't working, we could just shift the purpose, which is really nice. Okay, so for engaged reading, so if everyone is doing independent reading, her intellectual purpose was really around choosing text. Now, because she's not decoding, we did have some text for her that was at her level. It was a lot of pictures and some kind of words connected to the vocabulary. We had to create those, and in the next video strategy, I'm going to show you what that looked like. For the social purpose, we gave her the option a couple days a week for her to choose to read with a partner. And so that required a script for her to say, with a peer, would you like to read with me? And then also some teaching for the peers to know how to read with Puneet and what that meant and what that looked like. Her personal purpose, again, just thinking about this from a task analysis, her job was to choose a book from her bin, to choose a partner, and to choose a location. So that's how we structured it for her. So as you can see, she needs all three of these to be able to participate in this activity. But, this didn't take a lot of time, but it helped us to know what the next step was for building kind of supports for her to be able to do that. So I don't want to go through all of these. I will leave these up on here so you can take a look at them. The other one, though, I want to kind of to share with you is the current events. If you don't know about the website News to You, it's a really incredible website. It's connected to Unique Learning Systems, which I pull in a lot for this work. And basically what I really love about it is that it is connected to standards. It's American, but there are some really nice connections to Canadian content as well. And News to You is basically articles for current day events, but they're presented at different reading levels, all the way from someone who is at a picture level all the way to someone who's kind of conventional or can read it at simple paragraph level. And so if you have any kids in any social studies classes and you're looking to pull in some current event links, News to You is an incredible resource. And because it's in the news, there's often YouTube videos that are connected. And so what Puneet did was about once a month, she would share her article with the class and then show the video with everybody. And actually, because they're also really interesting, the students in the class really looked forward to that because, they're very high interest articles. And so there was actually a couple kids that asked if they could read the articles that Puneet brought in rather than the Globe and Mail because they just found them way more interesting. But then her personal purpose was also getting her comfortable standing in front of the class and being able to present this information to others, which I thought was kind of neat. The lesson here, it's hard to kind of go into this because the lesson might change every day, but we did have some activities for when there was an actual lesson where, people are listening. And so we needed some quiet activities for Puneet to do that she could work on, but we made sure that those activities were connected to the context of the lesson. And that's what we're going to spend some time looking at. The next strategy will be that kind of like, how do you plan for a student who has a cognitive disability in especially high school classes where there is a time where kids are listening and things have to be quiet. And so these are really around independent activities that are still connected, but I can appreciate that there is a time sometimes when the peers will move beyond cognitively and there needs to be something for all kids to do. Stay tuned, that's coming. And then last but not least is how do we actually break down the sharing circle so that it's not just Puneet sitting there, but actually it's meaningful for her. And we actually made her a little social story about what it means to be a part of sharing circle and why that's important. So this didn't take long, but it became a really critical blueprint. So like, even if, for example, Puneet had to arrive late for class for whatever reason, the support staff that was with her could immediately look at what was happening in the class and align it to the classroom activities at the time, and get her involved right away. And what was nice about this is because there was a social element all the time, there was never a need for Puneet to have separate activities on the side and never have any connection with anyone else in the class. And so the social really kept it connected. The intellectual kept it connected as long as our activities were connected to the context. And then the personal purpose was really about how are we teaching how to exist in a positive way as opposed to just telling her what not to do. And so this is a great strategy. I use this one all the time. And I encourage you to try it, and I'll have this template on the website for you to take a look at. The next example is a grade 2 example, and what I like about this one is that this student wasn't in the class at all. This student was having a very hard time because he would have really loud vocalizations that were really hard when the other kids are trying to focus or whatever. So we kind of look at just the morning. We just started with the morning to say, okay, let's really structure this so that Gabriel knows exactly what he's supposed to be doing, because often the vocalizations came with anxiety, and often the anxiety happened because there was a lot of waiting time. I kind of really feel for our EAs sometimes who are kind of put in situations and they don't know what the class is going to be about. And so they're kind of put on the spot to kind of modify on the fly. And if our support staff is having to do that, then the student is left waiting. And so this was really targeted so that whenever Gabriel was there, we knew exactly what he needed to be doing, so that it really reduced the wait time. And so we just targeted kind of the first 3 main activities of the day. And then once those were successful, then we were able to build on to that, because what was happening for him was as soon as he got loud, the EA would pull him out because she thought he was bothering the class. But what ended up happening was there was a time for him where he could be vocal, but we did it during work time. And so it really was a training about when it is okay to have noise and when it's not okay to have noise, as opposed to just removing him because he's noisy. Because I think it's reality to deal with vocalization sometimes, and it doesn't mean that it's a distraction all the time, but it's knowing when. So we started at the beginning of the day, the first kind of 3 blocks. This class starts with calendar, and so the students are really practicing days of the week of the month, and they tied math into this, and we're using the calendar to track prime numbers. Now, Gabriel had different intellectual goals. He was in charge of the weather, and he was in charge of identifying what today was. He was also in charge of birthdays and who lost their teeth. So he actually had a really big job during calendar time, and the rest of the peers were awesome about that, and they knew. But that allowed him to be vocal in a way that was purposeful and meaningful as soon as he got there. And so the social purpose, he had to report the weather to the class. He had to ask everyone if anyone had lost a tooth or if it was anyone's birthday. And then the personal purpose is just the kind of task breakdown of what we made for visuals, so he knew what to do. Class meeting was cool because class meeting was a time where everyone had a feeling check-in, but it also included daily movement and attendance. This was really nice, and the reason why we looked at this block of time is because this is a time where Gabriel can be vocal. They used a website called GoNoodle, which if you don't know about GoNoodle, go look at GoNoodle. It's incredible. And so they would pick kind of a different dance every day. And so he got to be a part of that. But because everyone was being vocal, he could too. And often the songs on that website are very catchy. And so the kids were singing along. So another opportunity for him to be vocal in an appropriate way. And then after the daily movement was done, then he could do attendance. And it wasn't just him doing it on the side. He actually, because his goal was to learn the name of his peers, he would say, good morning, and he would say hello, and the kids would say hi back. And then he could take a break because that was a lot for him. And so he took a little 5-minute break and took the attendance. This class had folders down to the office, but then he came back and then they did math time. And so usually having those two active activities first thing in the morning allowed him to help his regulation. And so that when math time came, when it was a little bit of a quieter setting, at least for the mini lesson part, he was able to at least do a quiet activity at his desk, because I can appreciate it's hard to teach when someone is loud. And so this also helped him to know when it was okay to be loud or when it wasn't okay to be loud. And so during math time, he had his math goals, and he would join the small groups. But during the actual lesson time, he had the choice of either sitting at the carpet with the class or doing some quiet math activities at his desk. And so I guess the what we really liked about this strategy is, it gave the support working with Gabriel more than one option, because if you only have an intellectual purpose or you only have a personal purpose and that one's not working, then kind of the first instinct is to leave the class, whereas this gives us multiple kind of pathways to the same destination. And so this really worked for Gabriel. And so what happened was, after we kind of figured out these 3 places, then we kept adding, and over the year, I think he was there for most of the day. So I think it really needed that targeted, though, for both Gabriel, but also for the support staff who was supporting him, to know what to do and why he was being a part of these activities. So a few key things to remember when we're developing our purposes for these places. It's not about the should. It's not about, what should kids be doing, but it is about the could. And what I love about that is could looks at what's possible, and it kind of takes into consideration where they are now, because you know what? They could do something, but it may never be where it should be. And so I think it also honors the growth as opposed to that kind of proficiency that some kids may never get to, but it doesn't mean they can't learn. These purposes that we're describing, it's also really important that they're not deficits, and instead they're described as positive and strength-based. And so if this looks familiar, it's probably because it is, because everything I'm sharing you here is basically based on the fundamental principle of positive behavior supports, which is, we want to describe what we want kids to do rather than telling them what we don't want them to do. Because what happens when we are teaching them what we don't want, then often the data that we collect is around what they aren't doing as opposed to what they are doing. And so just a few examples. Instead of teaching or keeping track of hitting, you could try, what do you want them to do instead of hitting? So depending on kind of the function of that behavior, it might be keeping hands to myself in my space, or, if it's an escape, allow them to take a break and teach them how to ask for that. Or instead of not getting into people's spaces, maybe try saying hello or asking to join a group. This is a nice example. They should be decoding words. Well, if they're not decoding words, then we kind of have to figure out where they're at. And so instead it could be finding words I know, trying out some new ones. So it kind of honors where they are and what's next, as opposed to just focusing on where they aren't. Another one, they should be listening. Instead, you could say, notice the sound around, right? How loud or how quiet is it? Quiet body, quiet voice. And so in all of those trying examples, it's describing what we want kids to do rather than telling them what we don't want them to do. Now, I showed you some examples of school, but this is not just limited to school. You could, do this in the community, the grocery store, you could do the swimming pool, and it's kind of a neat activity actually, because you realize that of all the places that we go, we do this all the time. And so I'm going to also include a template that is community oriented rather than classroom oriented. It's exactly the same. I just changed classroom to community, so that if you want to try this to see, what are the skills that we can teach and support in different areas of the community, you can absolutely do that. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with, and this is from Nicole Eredics, who is in California and is the author of a really incredible book and theinclusiveclass.com. She posted an article the other day that just summed up so nicely what we're trying to capture here. When we think of inclusive settings and students especially with cognitive disabilities, often there is this assumption that we have to catch them up or just kind of push them along, and that's not the goal here. And so I love this quote. She says, in an inclusive setting, students with cognitive disabilities are not expected to work at grade level or to keep up with the other students. Instead, they're asked to keep learning. And I think this is really the goal here. And knowing and believing that they can learn, knowing and believing that they deserve access to those intellectual goals, especially. But even if they never catch up, it doesn't mean they're not learning. And I think I'm getting a lot of questions about the difference between kind of explicit and strategic instruction. And explicit instruction, absolutely, there's a time and a place for it. But when we're working with kids in classrooms where the grade level is different than our kids with disabilities, this is called strategic instruction. And it's not about catching them up. It's about making the grade accessible. You know, how do we make grade 9 accessible? How do we make grade 2 accessible? And that is strategic instruction. And so just that reminder that we're not trying to close the gap. We're trying to create access. And so that's just something to hold into your pocket. So next video strategy, we are going to dive into this a little bit deeper. So I've highlighted just kind of, you know, when we talk about text or books or looking at topic specific vocabulary, like what does that mean? Like how do we make Social Studies 9 accessible for a student from an intellectual perspective? Meaning, you know, because I mean, Puneet couldn't read the grade 9 textbook. And so what were some context or place specific resources and materials that we could create for her so that during that time she had some activities that were connected to not just the class, but also her peers. Okay, my friends, that is the episode. So thanks for tuning in. The next content that will be released is November 26th, and that will be where on the podcast we share stories from you. And I've been getting some really great stories, and these stories are connected to people being should on, but also people who have overcome the should by kind of dismantling the should, which I think has been really exciting. So I've got some really innovative stories to tell you. If you have a story where you have overcome a should, send it to me because we're still looking for a couple more. You can email me at 5moreminutes@gmail.com, but it's more like my name, Oore. And so I'll be looking forward to those emails. So thanks for tuning in, and I will see you in a week.